G'day mate, Luke Ford here, and I'm joined by author Jon Entine of the Genetic Literacy Project. Jon, you published your first book when, about 1999, is that correct?
Yeah, right, January of 2000.
Okay, and your first book was on a taboo topic, but it really grew out of an NBC News documentary that you did with Tom Brokaw. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about your first book and that initial documentary project that you did with Tom Brokaw.
Yeah, I was a television network news producer for ABC and NBC News for many years, and including a long stint as Tom Brokaw's producer. And one day he and I were in a friendly argument about why so many American sports seem to be dominated increasingly so by African American athletes, and the world track and field scene had, in terms of running, had almost been taken over by Black Africans and and blacks of African descent. And I was claiming it was genetics, and he was saying no, it's the classic, they're escaping the ghetto and trying to overcome cultural, financial issues. And obviously I thought there was an element of that, but I had become convinced, maybe as a failed college football place kicker, that there was a genetic component to it. And after much discussion, he got management to overcome their reluctance and approve a documentary called Black Athletes, Fact and Fiction, examining the genetic and the sociological arguments for it. And it was a huge success, touched off quite an international debate, hundreds of articles, got us in some hot water because we dared to suggest that there were genetic hardwired differences between populations. But I think it overall was constructive, and out of that came a book contract that led to my book, Taboo, Why Black Athletes Dominate Sports and Why We're Afraid to Talk About It. It really reflected my a dominant stream in all of my work, which is I like to take on subject matter that's deeply rich and controversial, where I think that political ideology, political correctness has been putting a cap on what we're allowed to say when these are really important issues. In this case, the genetics of human differences is so important because so many diseases affect one population more than another. So what might seem like a somewhat trivial debate over sports differences, even though sports obviously is a huge international phenomenon, it actually has deep medical and also human relations consequences. So that's the history of that, and generally why I've taken up the mantle of taking on controversial subjects.
Now, there's a widespread opinion that anyone who works in television is, like, at best, a mid-level IQ. But because the TV medium, of course, you're aiming at a 100 IQ crowd on average, I would assume. But the people who are making TV are not morons. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about that misconception.
When now you've damned an industry with faint praise, actually. But I actually don't think that that's true. I think that obviously there's a lot of junk on TV, but there's a lot of high quality stuff as well. A lot of thoughtful documentaries. Some news people are among the smartest people I've ever come across. It's not just showmanship. To be a really good television news journalist at the highest level, you have to go through a winnowing out process where the lower IQs, if you call it, really get phased out. So I was excited to take on a controversial subject. And I think the fact that it was turned into a best-selling book and has led to multiple books on genetics and human behavior, controversial books, but thoughtful, very well reviewed, and ultimately led to the founding of my nonprofit, which focuses on biotechnology and its impacts on everything from vaccines to gene therapy to GMOs and gene-edited crops. It's called the Genetic Literacy Project, geneticliteracyproject.org. And it's a outreach and education group, but it challenges misinformation by bad journalists. most of whom happen to be in print, I have to tell you.
What are the skills that it takes to work in network news?
Well, it depends on what level you're operating at and where your focus is. I was a news producer, which unlike in the entertainment field, it means something different. Entertainment producers are the money bags, the people behind the scenes who kind of wire the original structure of a project. The news producers are essentially the journalists who work the beat, who do the gumshoe investigations or background. And I was involved in longer form pieces, working for 2020, Primetime Live, did long features for the NBC Nightly News for Tom Brokaw for many years. So we do a lot of background work, a lot of the interviewing and writing of it. So I found that very fulfilling. A lot of people think of, Fox News talking heads or CNN commentators in the evening or MSNBC as a synonym for television news, but that's not. That's the blowhard section. Doesn't mean that there aren't smart people doing some of those things. Doesn't mean that you might not learn something from it, but that's a different discipline than the hard news division that I grew out of.
What about the effect of groupthink? Every occupation comes with groupthink, and one notices with journalism that with pretty much every major story, suddenly all the news outlets are approaching it with about the same emotional temperature. They've already kind of decided who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, and how we're going to cover this. Doesn't matter if it's NBC News, LA Times, they all come with the same sort of emotional approach to a story. So that's got to be a product of groupthink. So how every profession has groupthink. What are some of the dangers of groupthink in the profession that you were in, and how did you escape from it?
Well, I do think you're right. There is a lot of conformity, even when the journalists believe that they're asking out of the box questions. They're asking it usually asking those questions within rather narrow parameters. I think I'm very liberal minded. I'm not a science denier. Believe climate change is the most pressing problem of our times. I might quibble over what's the best way to address it. But basically, I consider myself a liberal minded person. Certainly reject Trumpism, which is really frightening and autocratic and totalitarian. But I would say that there is a political correctness that dominates television news, but also journalism, mainstream journalism in general. And I think it's a liberal bias. I think there's a very important reason why, for instance, mainstream journalists didn't anticipate Trump possibly even winning the election in 2016. I think they were out of touch with the vast majority of America, which tends to be a little bit less well-educated than perhaps journalists are, didn't go to elite schools, don't only socialize with people who take a fairly dogmatic liberal viewpoint. So there's not enough room for heterodoxy. I think I'm a heterodox by nature. I used to have a column for Forbes magazine called The Contrarian, but I'm not a contrarian for the sake of being a contrarian. I'm a believer of a Greek way of thinking called Epoche, Epoche, which is really, it's called framing. And you try to look at every new idea or fact and frame it and almost try to see it devoid of as many prejudicial inputs as you can. And when you start doing that, you come up with new views of what issues really are. And sometimes your views even disconcert yourself. I mean, I get disconcerted sometimes when I allow myself to follow the facts because sometimes I'm uncomfortable with what the facts tell me. But I really have come to believe that I'm willing to, live in that world of hard knocks where you say what you believe is the truth, say it in a way that's not dogmatic, say it in a way that encourages conversation. But I have to say that, as you rightly pointed out, I think there is a bit of a groupthink, tends to be kind of liberal, except now there's a whole right-wing echo chamber insular system from Fox News to other networks to an incredible online presence that in its own way is a juggernaut, equally as suppressive and sophomoric as the knee-jerk left.
So, for an example of this groupthink, almost all the mainstream media journalistic coverage of how the Trump administration reacted to COVID was that it was incredibly incompetent, when statistically there's really no difference between how the Trump administration and other industrialized nations reacted to COVID. But from the Washington Post to PBS and Frontline to the Los Angeles Times, they all reacted the same way. There was virtually no sense of an international perspective, like, oh, let's compare how the United States is dealing with this compared to other industrialized nations, except in kind of narrowly drawn ways to make the Trump administration look bad. And the countries that supposedly did really well among the industrialized nations with COVID, they weren't doing anything different than the United States tried. It's not like New Zealand and Australia or Japan or Taiwan had these incredibly innovative techniques that the United States, was just too bumbling and incompetent to try. So, one, do you grant my premise from what you read and saw of mainstream media coverage of how the Trump administration reacted to COVID? And two, if there's something to what I'm saying, how do you account for groupthink in the mainstream news media?
Well, I agree with some of what you said, and I would take issue with a couple of things. I do think our overall death numbers per capita suggest that we didn't handle it particularly well, though that is really dramatically skewed by New York City and the New York area region, which is, of course, took the most restrictive measures. So I can't really hang New York's reaction and its bad situation on the Trump administration per se. But overall, there, many other countries did better than us. But I think the problem with the Trump administration is its rhetoric and its arrogance, and Donald Trump himself, who I've said this to other people. There's some of his policies that I actually support in certain areas, like in the areas of biotechnology regulation, for instance. I thought Sonny Perdue was a very good Secretary of Agriculture and kind of let Perdue do what he needed to do, partly because it wasn't an area of political interest to Donald Trump. But his rhetoric was inflammatory. He divided people. You can't escape the fact that he's an arrogant SOB and in my mind unfit to have been president. That said, many of the policies that we instituted early on, including some of the things that he pushed, were as reactive in a positive way as any place else in the world. And as you said, there's a certain logic to a horrible logic to a disease that was uncontrollable to a large extent. And the missteps were as much done by Trump as it was by the international community, which didn't understand how diseases spread, didn't understand the role that masks could play, didn't understand that lockdowns should never have occurred on children and younger people. Our understanding of risk even today is skewed. And that continues because of this groupthink. It's been horrible. So, I mean, where I think there's a lot of legitimate criticism of Trump, there isn't in a sense of accountability in scaring people. And COVID is horrible. My daughter got it. I have experienced a friend of mine's 32-year-old daughter with no symptoms died of COVID. So it's a serious issue. But on the other hand, we could have managed it a lot more smartly. And some of the things that the Trump administration was suggesting in their own bubbling, inept, and in my case, in my belief, offensive way, were actually probably would have been better choices. Opening up earlier and focusing only on higher risk populations probably would have served our country a lot better than the way that the liberal intelligentsia, to use a better word, I'm uncomfortable a little bit about using that, but really had an agenda of their own, what they thought was the best way. So I basically agree with you with caveats.
This is a connected question, even though it sounds disconnected. How many people did you meet in the mainstream media who were pro-life? In other words, they regarded abortion as murder.
I'm not sure I could say anyone for sure.
I think I can. Zero. I mean,
Yeah.
I've talked to all sorts of journalists who worked in the mainstream media. None of them can name one person who believes in a point of view that's held by approximately 40% of the population. And
Yeah,
I'm not advertising for that point of view. It's just how different from regular Americans journalists are, particularly at the elite level.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I'll try to add a little bit of nuance to it. I don't have a problem with someone who is not pro-life or someone who is pro-life. I happen to be, I have reservations about abortion, but I'm generally speaking quite supportive of it. But I absolutely side with you on the on my disgust with people who believe that anyone who is pro-life is automatically a cretin and a narrow-minded bigot. Because the people that I know, I mean, I'm sure there are people who fit that, but the people that I know who struggle with it, including one of my best girlfriends and boyfriends from growing up, who I introduced as 12th graders, and she ended up getting pregnant the next year and came to me as a 19-year-old for my advice on whether she should seek an abortion. And I encouraged her to really reach in hard in her soul about what would be important to her. And she and her husband to be decided not to have an abortion and has two wonderful kids. She was a kind of a poor working class girl who ended up becoming a nurse and got bored with it and then became a very wealthy anesthesiologist. And he was a Catholic kid, the oldest of 10, who had to move to California to go to college to support himself, ended up getting his PhD in electrical engineering. These are smart people, and they're very liberal-minded. I could say that they're no fan of Trump, but they are pro-life. And the fact that we can't have a public discussion and acknowledge that this is a richly personal and spiritual issue is a sign of the, I curdle at the word cancel culture because I think the right uses it as much as the left. But this is an example of left-wing groupthink cancel culture, no question.
Yeah, but my point is how unrepresentative elite journalists are. I have never spoken to an elite journalist who's been able to name one peer in elite journalism who's pro-life. So do you think that my experience is not representative? And if it is even remotely representative, then journalists obviously are absolutely nothing like the American people as a whole, which is fine, but it seems like an obvious point that should be acknowledged.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, you can't, this isn't the GDR, this isn't East Germany. We can't say, each year we want 19,718 people to become journalists, and we're going to pick them from various demographic groups. It's like whoever wants to go in that profession is going to go in that profession. There might be some selectivity out of people who have somewhat conservative viewpoints. I have no doubt management in various operations are prejudiced against people with a conservative point of view. No doubt that that's true. And ultimately, it can cost you your career, because I know out-of-the-box thinkers who are frankly not even conservative, but had dared to espouse views that are in conflict with a liberal mainstream viewpoint of things, are excommunicated from the field. It is a fact that journalists tend to be hegemonically liberal, and to some degree, many of them, especially the not smart ones, rejectionist and contemptuous of people who don't share their worldview.
So let's just say, for the point of discussion, that per capita COVID death rates in the United States were approximately in the middle of what other European industrialized nations achieved. If I'm in the ballpark there, then the mainstream media coverage of America's response to COVID is just incredibly disjointed or out of touch with reality. I mean, I'm basically just building on analysis by David Wallace Wells in New York Magazine, but essentially he wrote a great piece, How the West Lost COVID. How did so many rich countries get it so wrong? How did others get it so right? And essentially he makes the point that per capita death levels in the United States are approximately the same as other European industrialized nations, but there was virtually never that sense of context in almost any of the news media coverage that I saw in the United States, it was all on how awful the United States is doing, when that just does not seem to be true to reality. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think, as you say, raised earlier, there's the dislike at a deeply visceral level of Donald Trump was so overwhelming that they were going to laminate defeat and humiliation onto him at any cost. And so I think that tone is just infuses the news media and does affect their coverage. And again, Donald Trump is, in my mind, was contentious and was a divisive figure that I think has done permanent damage to the American population. But what we learned, I think the COVID thing should humble anyone. It was something that no one could control, and actually certain measures that the U.S. took, for instance, I think pushing in some states, mostly Republican states, to open up, especially in schools and other places, actually were the smarter decision to make. I'm not sure they were made for the right reasons. In some cases, I think that they were. In other cases, I think it was purely a reaction to what they saw as the liberal take on things. But the fact is that this disease confounded everyone, and the narrative that's been painted and has emerged and remains so today is heavily skewed against Trump equals the United States view of the world. No question.
How did you realize that part of the reason that certain athletes dominate certain sports is to do with genetics? How did you realize that in your discussion with Tom Brokaw?
Well, I mean, I intuitively thought that might be the case when I was 19, 20 years old. I think I was, maybe right around then. Sports Illustrated came out with a seminal front page article on why are blacks coming to dominate sports. We're talking the early 1970s, when at that point the NBA in 10 years had gone from 20% African American black to 80%. The NFL had gone from 10% black to 65%. Baseball, if you include black Latinos, blacks represent 12% of the U.S. population. 33% of baseball players has actually gone down since then, partly because baseball is now thought of more as a white sport, and it historically been the black sport from the time of the Negro Leagues onward. So I intuitively thought that could play a role. I thought about it, and I'm a curious type. I've always been a heterodox in whatever job I've been in. I think always a thoughtful one. I was prized at NBC because I was considered an out-of-the-box thinker and had the trust of Tom Brokaw and upper management. And they thought that I was going to give an original take on things. And sometimes they were surprised because it contradicted what they thought I was going to say. And in this case, ultimately, Tom and I came together on this. And as we explored the evidence, it was somewhat rudimentary at that point. But what was one thing that was very clear, for instance, was that this is not really a black-white issue per se. It's really about body types and our ancestry. So you look at running. To me, that's the ultimate laboratory for seeing differences among populations. And you look at speed running from, let's say, the 100 meters all the way through the 400 meters. Every single world record and the top 200 to 300 top athletes are all of West African ancestry. In the case of the 100 meters, the top 2,400 100-meter running times are held by a person of West African ancestry. Yet there's not one West African, not one in the world who's an elite 800-meter runner and longer. They're dominated by people of East African ancestry, Kenyans, Tanzanians, and there's not one. I think that the best rated Kenyan 100-meter runner is like 4,600th ranked in the world. I mean, in other words, insignificant. You can't tell me that the Kenyan runners who love the pageantry and the lucrative payoff of becoming a elite level, Olympic level long distance runner wouldn't go after 100-meter events, which take a far less training and toll on your bodies if they could, but they can't because they don't have the body type for it. So I just found that the facts began to tumble out. They were so overwhelming. And then the story morphed from, here's the story about the facts, to now we're back to the situation with COVID and explaining it. Why are we afraid to talk about it? So I did originally a documentary on the phenomenon and a little bit about the censoring of discussion about human differences, the controversy that discussing that racially based human differences, or population based, to use a less charged term, to writing a book 10 years later, called Taboo, Why Black Athletes Dominate Sports and Why We're Afraid to Talk About It, which really was mostly about why we're afraid to talk about it. And we're afraid to talk about it because we can't have honest discussions without some form of political correctness and cancel culture stepping in. And that's okay. We don't require that sports commentators tell every bit of context, but I'll tell you where it really matters is if you're a black and you need a bone marrow transplant and you go to a hospital and they tell you we can't give you bone marrow because the only bone marrow we have are from whites, and if we give it to you, it's going to be rejected by your body because people of African ancestry don't have the same histocompatibility standards as whites do. And so these issues would go far beyond sports. Sports become an emblem of discussing human differences. And that's what fascinated me, that we're actually willing to deny the nose in front of our face.
Most people in the middle class don't like to talk about racial differences. And then there's a tiny group of people who don't like to talk about anything but racial differences, but they usually do it in a provocative and nasty way. How on earth did you pull off this simultaneous trick of being heterodox and working well with other people at elite levels?
It's interesting. The liberal magazine Slate wrote a very positive review of my book, and its general theme was, how was Jon Entine able to write a book like this, not lose his career, not get threatened with death when and they compared it to an incident in the United States. You may or may not recall
Jimmy the Greek
Snyder, who was fired just for discussing in a fairly inelegant way, but still in an honest way. He was not racist. He didn't have a racist bone in his body, I don't think. But he raised the idea that black and white differences were rooted in the slave trade, which we don't believe at all is true. It's the evolutionary differences are hardwired over quite some time, 5,000 to 25,000 years of evolutionary differences. But I was lucky. I don't know. Because I think I was an honest broker. I mean, you can read, I have sections that talk about intelligence differences, and I don't shy away from what the data says. So I remember giving a talk in Seattle once. We're basically talking about Liberal Central. And I was they have a very famous bookstore there. Maybe it was Portland, I think. Portland or Seattle. Anyway, same thing from a liberal perspective. And as I was talking about my book, a white guy gets up and says, you're really racist. This is the idea that you're even suggesting that there could be hardwired black-white differences. You're just opening up the Pandora's box of racism. And I think you're really demeaning blacks. And so, two blacks got up together because they had been talking to each other and says, hold it. What is this white guy telling me as a black person what I should think about this issue? I've read his book. His book is one of the most honest, enlightened things that really provokes some deep thinking on me and reflecting about a lot of these issues. And you're the racist by trying to squelch this kind of thinking and discussion, because he laid his cards on the table and he invited a discourse on this. And that's what we lack today. We really have a situation where there's almost like a programmatic left. It's very Stalin-esque. It's very GDR-like. And it comes as much from the political left as it comes from the political right. The difference is the political left believes that they are purer than Snow White on these things. And they're not. They're censorious and they're narcissistic and self-serving in some cases.
Didn't Barack Obama read your book, Taboo?
There was one reference saying that he read the book, yes. And it was somewhat said it was an interesting book, I think is what as far as he would go. Look, I was on television. I was on CNN. I was on National Public Radio 4 or 5 times. I did over 500 TV and radio interviews, and there were more than 400 print reviews of the book. It was the most heavily reviewed book over a 2-year period when it came out. So there was a chance to discuss these things, but it's so interesting because we've now regressed on the issue of talking about human differences back to the point that I don't think I could get that book published today, even though it was widely endorsed by everything from Scientific American to Human Biology magazine to the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. These are really high-end science journals that gave it glowing reviews, let alone the African American columnists for the Washington Post, for the Hartford Courant, Ebony magazine. I mean, it just got great reviews, better than Stephen Jay Gould, who's a very controversial figure and considered one of the bright lights of genetic science. I mean, a lot of his books, I think, have some interesting points, but some say really ridiculous, politically correct things that are just unmoored from the facts. So I think I was able to navigate that ship fairly well, but I think I chose to be willing to face the world of hard knocks. I was willing to take fire. And I think once you're willing to take fire and are going to lay it out and you're not cutting the corners to ensure your politically correct ass, then I think people appreciated that, and I ended up coming out of it okay.
And then you came out with a book in 2005 about Jews and genetics. What led you to that book, and what were the challenges with that book?
Yeah, it was actually a very funny discussion with my agent, saying, "Look, you have a really great book here. This is in the first book, Taboo. I really, think you should maybe consider doing another follow-up on genetics, because you really know how to write about this about inflammatory subjects in a way that keeps the flame burning for interest's sake, but doesn't let it consume you and the subject matter." And I said, what should I do it on? I don't really know. And right at that time, my sister had been diagnosed with breast cancer, and she ended up being tested and found out that she has a genetic version of the breast cancer. It's called a BRCA mutation that traces back to her Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. And soon after, and my mother, my aunt, and my grandmother all died within 1 year of each other when I was in high school. And so as I was thinking about that, he said to me, "You should do a story on Jews." I said, "Well, why Jews?" He says, "Well, Jews buy books and they also get genetic diseases. It's the perfect match for you to do a story on it." So I decided that I want to do the same issue. Believe it or not, Jews were defined as a race, and they actually defined themselves as a race up until World War II. It was just common descriptions. Jews would say that they were a race. It just the whole experience with the Holocaust and genocide linked to racial identity really, I think, for the first time ever historically, separated the connection between Jews and race, though many people still think of the Jews as a population, as a people. And I thought this was fascinating. I want to explore this. And here there's a direct link to the potential benefits of understanding this, because so many of our disorders, medical conditions, are linked to our race, are linked to our population ancestry. You don't have to use the term race, which is a very problematic term, as Taboo spent 350 pages talking about why the race term is problematic. But we do have human differences, and the fact is, if you're Jewish, you have a higher chance of getting a genetic disorder. My sister who got breast cancer ultimately died of genetic form of pancreatic cancer linked to her Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. So I was fascinated by that, and I was also fascinated by how what distinguished Christianity and Islam from Judaism is that they unmoored religion from ancestry. You talk about blood in the New Testament. Blood for Jesus and his disciples means faith. Blood in the New Testament and the Old Testament means blood. It's real thing. And I thought that's fascinating to see how all religions were tribal religions until Jesus. And except for, and the only surviving tribal religions today of note are Judaism and Zoroastrianism. All the rest are faith-based religions, and many Jews don't even realize that they're part of a something that's as much about culture and history as it is about genetics itself. So I thought all these things made it fascinating to me. I'm an atheist, but I was raised Jewish. I majored in religion at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. I really respect Islam and respect Christianity, and thought that the whole genetics entree into talking about religion was a uniquely interesting way to talk about the same issues that I raised in Taboo. There's a lot of overlap and similarity between the two, though if you read them, they're totally different books, but that some of the themes are the same. How do we talk about human differences in a respectful way?
I'm thinking part of the reason for your success in talking about human differences in a way that hasn't gotten you canceled is that you innately have grown up with and have mastered the rhetoric of the elite. I don't know anyone who's not elite who uses the word problematic. So you seem to have, you've naturally mastered the language of the elite, and so therefore they feel more comfortable hearing you discuss things. Do you think that's fair?
I guess I'm not self-conscious of some of that. I think I am I'm aware of that. But frankly, nothing pleases me more than sticking my finger in the eyes of liberal elitists. It's, I work in the area of genetically modified foods, genetic engineering, gene-edited crops, and I've spent a lot of my time over the past 10 years focusing on human-related issues and COVID vaccine development and other things, but really on how you educate the people about a technology that is very progressive in the best sense of the word. We are really empowering the developing world to deal with the effects of climate change and to deal with the effects of less arable land, and giving them control over their food destiny, which really means giving them control over their destiny. And who's opposed to it? Crazy liberals who like have swallowed the myth of naturalism whole. And so I although it pains me that those are my antagonists on a lot of these issues, nothing is more fun than going after a hard-headed, self-righteous, cancel culture promoting woke liberal.
What is your IQ?
I don't know.
What was your GPA in college?
I was a philosophy major. In philosophy, I was a 4.0, but in things that I didn't like, I had no problem with getting a B or B minus in things I didn't like. But that's not important. I think I don't think that I'm necessarily the highest IQ. I think I'm in the low 130s, to be honest, from what I can tell based on my SATs and things like that. I think some of this is really, do you think out of the box? And that's somewhat of an IQ thing, but it's really a sensibility thing. I really do believe my whole life, even as a little kid, I was always the one who thought a little bit differently. I grew up in a fairly affluent, upper middle class community, very liberal. And I remember I was in first grade, I don't know, 9 years old, something like that. And our teachers, it was an election between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. And the teacher said, let's hold a class election, like 8 years old. I didn't know policy from salami. I didn't know anything about this. So who are you going to vote for? And there was 26 kids in the class. 25 voted for John Kennedy. I voted for Richard Nixon. I ended up loathing Richard Nixon 10 years later. And I was a true blue Democrat in large ways. But at the time, I just I couldn't believe if all these people want one person, then they can't be, there's a flaw here. Because that's the way autocracy, and now I would use these words, that's the way autocracy works. I can't believe in groupthink like that. So I'm voting for the underdog. And I think I've had that sensibility all the time. And at times it gets me in trouble. But I think overall, getting back to that framing technique called Epoche, I try to look at each situation and be fearless about where the facts take me. And I try to do it on everything. And I have usual bedfellows as a result of that. I've been a member of one of the more, I would say, moderate conservative think tanks, the American Enterprise Institute, but also one of the most liberal think tanks, the World Food Institute out of the University of California, Berkeley. And I'm good friends with Charles Murray, controversial writer of The Bell Curve, and I share a lot of his very informed views on a lot of issues. but I work with the Aspen Institute and on as almost a classically far left or moderate left organization in promoting alternative viewpoints. What they all share, what Charles Murray and the Aspen Institute both share, they're willing to think out of the box, and they're not just hegemonic, knee-jerk liberals or conservatives.
What were your SATs?
My SATs were, I don't know, 15, 20, something like that combined.
And were you higher in verbal or math?
I was higher in math, much higher in math. I didn't have any intentions of being a writer, and I didn't have much confidence in my writing abilities. And then I went through a transformation. I wanted to be a political science major. I dropped out of college. To give you an idea of my liberalness, I dropped out of college to work for George McGovern and run a county for him in New Hampshire in the 1972 election. But I went through a transformative spiritual awakening that didn't ultimately draw me to religion, but it drew me to spirituality, and it drew me to question how I view the world. I had a fairly nuanced view, I think, of religion. I don't think I was nearly as open-minded as for people who had views that were different from mine, other than my human impulses. From an intellectual point of view, I was fairly crusted over. If I had become that person, I wouldn't be friends with that person now. And I just became, I became attracted to philosophy and the philosophy of religion, because it basically is about asking questions. It's not always about the answers. And you're rewarded as a philosophy major, a religion major, in how refined and thoughtful your questions are, not what your answers are. And to me, that was a transformative, that changed my brain. It literally changed the structure of my brain. So I remember reading things that I had read 2 years before, and it took on an entirely different meaning. And things that I thought were ambiguous were really about how cool they changed perspectives. So I became a lover of Socrates and Plato, because that was really a lot about questioning, and was somewhat disdainful of Aristotle. Now, actually, in my older age, I'm much more Aristotelian in my viewpoint, because I want to actually get things done, not just debate them. But it was just interesting how I think that inquisitorialness, that's what's missing in journalism today. It seems like, and you pointed this out, I think rightly so, they start out with a conclusion and then find the facts to reinforce that conclusion, rather than keep an open mind and letting the facts dictate where they go.
At what age did you have this transformative spiritual experience? At what location, and what was the experience?
It was when I was, I dropped out of college during my sophomore year. As things were percolating in my head, I had done a little acid dropping, and of that generation. Although I probably only took acid five or six times, smoked a little bit of marijuana, did not use any pills, because I thought pills were anti-mind stimulating. They were all about body experiences. Not that I'm, even now that I'm more, much less judgmental about that. But at the time, I was really interested in mind stuff. And I spent, I probably read like every book that Freud ever, I read every book that Freud ever wrote. I even ultimately got into psychiatry graduate school, never having taken a psychology class in my entire time at college, because I thought psychology, as it was taught, was one of the, I call it one of the gutter subjects. Sociology was the bottom of the heap. Psychology was not much better than that. In terms of the seriousness, it was more like writing sophisticated novels in my mind, but it did open my mind to think in different ways. I mean, one week I was more Freudian in my mind, another week I maybe apply Hegelian philosophy to psychological issues, all kinds of things. And it was really, I think, a period from my sophomore year to my into my junior year that began a change in the structure of my mind and the way I asked questions and the way I looked at the world that has served me well. And I think I've actually matured in that over the years. And I find there's a whole community of heterodoxical thinkers. There's a website you may have heard called Quillette,
Yes.
which some people call it, this is a conservative website. It's the opposite of a conservative website. It is the most liberal website when you use the term liberal correctly. It's a liberal-minded website that where no question is out of bounds for them, as long as the writer is willing to challenge it and in a thoughtful way. And that's my community right there. I love that place, and I think that's what we need more of. People who are willing to go where the evidence takes them, even if it ends up overturning their own prejudices that they built over years and years of belief system. They have to be willing to change.
Okay, let me push you again to answer my question. What was the date of your transformative spiritual experience? Like, what was the month, what was the year, and what was the place?
It happened mostly, I think, in New Hampshire. Like I said, I dropped out of college to work for George McGovern. When the campaign was over, I briefly went home, got a construction job, and then decided I really loved New Hampshire and I wanted to spend the summer there. I got a job in 1973. I got a job 1972 rather at an inn working as a helper, and I got the top floor where I was and had about 60 books. So I read every one of them. I was reading a book or three a week, and I think that summer is when I came to a realization that I think differently about the world. Changed my college experience. I was a mediocre student bumbling by, and suddenly whatever I wanted to get an A at, I got an A at because my mind was different. It actually absorbed information like a sponge. And before, I was like in a hand-to-hand combat with information. And it was great.
You were 20 years of age.
Yeah.
And so you'd been in college for 2 years at this point?
2 years, yes.
And what were the drugs that you take that played a role in this transformation?
Well, I hadn't taken drugs in a year by that point. The drugs I took were really my freshman year. And so drugs didn't play any real role in that, other than it started me on the process of I think, questioning a bit more. So I think the last drugs I took were probably the summer before, and I had done no marijuana, no acid, nothing. But the overturning of my worldview was seeded the year before with drugs beginning to fracture some of my. I don't think I had a worldview so much. I was just an unreflective person. I only realized how much I didn't have a worldview was what the realization was, and I didn't need a worldview where everything fits together. I need a worldview that's by its very nature was about dialogue in your brain, dialogue with ideas, challenging things in a respectful way, and always being open to learning from people who you thought you didn't agree with. I remember one thing that started this was the year before when I was coming down from an acid trip. It might have been the last time I took acid. And I was in a park in Denver. I had hitchhiked out to Denver with a friend of mine. We were going to a conference in Aspen. We had organized these things called Walks Against Hunger in our community and raised $100,000 in my freshman year in college for these benefits. And as I was coming down from my acid trip, if you know anything about how acid works, it's kind of a weird, disassociated period where you're kind of connected to reality and not. And I got kind of challenged by someone who was a Jesus freak. And I was a Jewish kid who rejected religion, and the idea of adopting Christianity as my religion would have been an anathema to me. And I said, John, you are in the beginnings of a journey. You have to open your mind up to any way of thinking if it's credible and it really resonates. That's what you want. That's the kind of person you wanted to be. So I was already on that path. And I said, I'm now going to explore. This is what turned me into being a religion major. I'm going to explore Christianity in a respectful way rather than who can possibly believe that Jesus was resurrected? It doesn't make sense. I'm dismissing this religion out of hand. And so it set me on a path of questioning probably my deepest prejudices that I thought of Christianity as an unbelievable concept. It didn't ultimately matter whether Jesus had to have been resurrected and the truth of Jesus's life. If we all know anything about Christian history, and I talk a lot about it in my book, Abraham's Children, Christianity easily could have evolved in a different way where Jesus was a prophet. That's what the Alexandria wing of the early Christian movement wanted. They didn't see Jesus as the Son of God. They saw him as a prophet. Then there was the other wing, which is driven by the more conservative factions, and ultimately the conservative factions won, and the idea of Jesus as prophet was relegated to the dustbin of history. So anyway, that was the I was challenged emotionally, spiritually, everything. That was the beginnings of it.
What was the name of the inn that you worked at in New Hampshire?
The Lyme Inn, Lyme. It's 10 miles north of Hanover.
And how long were you dropped out of college for? You took a semester, a year?
And one of the reasons I went to the Lyme Inn is because it was right near Dartmouth, and I ended up taking summer classes at Dartmouth and essentially caught up with my class. So I ended up graduating on time.
So you took a semester off, is that?
I took a semester off and then did a summer school to catch up.
Did the experience of sex have a transformative effect?
Of sex?
Yes. I assume that you had sex in college, and that often changes people.
No, I was fairly conservative. I don't think I had intercourse till my second year, probably much well behind others. So hopefully I made up for lost time, but I don't think that was an issue in my transformation about how I viewed anything. No.
But it happened right before your transformation.
No, it happened in the middle of it, I would say. I don't think there's any relationship, frankly.
Okay, interesting. Who was the first person to notice your transformation?
It was pretty profound. I mean, I actually, there'd be, you could see my whole demeanor had changed, and everybody around me. When I came back to college, after having been out for a semester, in other words, I left in December of 1971 and came back in September of 1972. Everyone saw that I was had changed a lot. I felt more confident, and suddenly I also had a ton more friends as a result of this. But I didn't feel I have to prove anything anymore. I felt really confident in my own skin. I think for the first time in my life, I think a lot of us go through identity crises and a sense of self-discovery in college. Thankfully, I had the opportunity to do that. I didn't have to work during college. I did. I had a full-time job my freshman year, working 20 hours a week in television, writing and editing and producing the 11 p.m. news for the local NBC station. So I was very involved in television journalism for a long, long time. But yeah, it was very transformative. And
but you don't remember the first person who noticed that you'd transformed. You have this profound inner experience, then the first person who notices, I would think that you might remember that, because now you're realizing that what you're experiencing is really shining out.
Well, I could tell you that within a month of coming back, I developed an amazing relationship with a woman who became my college girlfriend, and was the first adult, post high school adult like romance of my life. So yeah, that was pretty profound. She knew me beforehand. It's not like she didn't like me, but she suddenly saw all these qualities in me. But part of that is just getting to know someone. So I think that was probably the most profound.
Was there anyone in your teens or 20s who had a pretty good inkling of the direction of your life, perhaps sharper than you did at the time?
Yeah, I think so. I had a really good friend who was 10 years older than me. He was a out-of-the-box thinker, a guy named David Gelber, who became quite famous for a lot of his documentary work for 60 Minutes. When I met him, he was just beginning to work in TV as a producer, but he was in his 30s. I was in my 20s. He had done a lot of political action stuff. He had been involved as part of the hippie activist social justice movement of the 1960s. And I found him a really interesting guy, and an out-of-the-box thinker as well. And I think we bonded. Like I said, he was 10 years older. I didn't think it was a mentor relationship. I think it was two close friends. He respected me and I respected him. But he was very influential, I think, in my formative years.
So he saw a direction? I mean, what did he see? What did he say? Where did he say you were going?
Well, he just saw me as someone who was really cared about journalism in the fullest sense of the word. That's really what it is. I'm a little uncomfortable in some of the directions we're going in, because I'm not that special. There's a lot of people who think independently, and I just am lucky enough that the things that I am writing about are ones that are in the popular consciousness right now, popular debate. So I'm going to do my best to create a genuinely constructive discussion around issues that have historically been taboo. And I don't mean the black-white differences so much. I mean, even, I have no problem calling out Trumpites in the Genetic Literacy Project, but I have no problem calling out the political correctness that infects the left either. So one day I see tweets saying, "Oh my God, the GLP, did they lose its soul?" And the next day it said, "Wow, that was an amazing takedown of those awful whatevers." And I think that's what we want to be. We want to, wherever the facts take us, take no prisoners, and ultimately hope people will respect you for your honesty and integrity, even if they don't agree with you.
Often mention how liberal you are. I assume that you mentioned this as a reflex because pretty much everyone most people in your social circle or social class regard being liberal equals good person, and so I just noticed this reflex in your rhetoric. Am I touching on anything important?
Well, I think I have a great respect for conservatism. I just don't have a respect for Trumpism. I think Trumpism is a disease. And it's a real rejection of things that I believe in. I'm a free thinker. I'm a classic free thinker. Classic free thinkers embrace conservative ideas as well as liberal ideas. I have no problem to say that Ronald Reagan, although I didn't agree with everything that he did, was a great president because he pushed back in a thoughtful way against excesses. And that's my kind of thinker. And I don't have to agree with everything that he said. So I deal in a lot of circles where there's a lot of conservatives. And I know the difference between a faux conservative, one who's just a liberal rejectionist, versus one who's actually like Charles Murray, for instance, who or people at Reason magazine, which is I would say a moderate conservative or libertarian, modest right viewpoint, where they're great friends of mine, and I embrace a lot of their viewpoints on things. And a lot of the positions I take, I'm very pro-fracking because I'm concerned about climate change. I'm very nuclear energy because I'm concerned about climate change, and I think these are two incredibly important tools in the toolbox. And I, although I support innovation in solar and wind and alternative energy projects, I'm not foolish enough to believe that we can abandon fossil fuels, not only for environmental reasons and economic reasons, but for geopolitical reasons. And so. All my friends are conservatives, not liberals. But what I think what I hate about the Trump administration and Trumpers, a lot of them, is that they are illiberal in the same way that a lot of liberals are illiberal. So I'm not afraid to call it out. But I am, generally speaking, I'd say, I'm a Trump rejectionist, but I'm not I wouldn't call myself a liberal, but for better or for worse, I use the term filled with all these caveats that go along with it.
How did you assemble your book on Jews and genetics? I mean, you must have been delving into a lot of academic material, and you don't have a PhD in genetics. So who do you know who to trust when, say, you've got competing geneticists saying opposite things?
Well, I think actually, if you go on Amazon reviews, for instance, I don't know, there's been 105 reviews. I think 90 of them are 5-star reviews. Wasn't nearly as controversial in its own way. It was deeply out of the box, but it's disguised in a historical wrapper. A lot of what I tried to do was tell the history of the three Abrahamic religions through the prism of genetics. And then had a lot of side subjects as a result of that. So a lot of it was just understanding history. It was reading the Quran and reading the Christian Bible and aspects of the Jewish Bible and the Torah for the first time, and reading it through and trying to understand it. And then it's like I did with Taboo. I literally talked to hundreds and hundreds of experts in the field, some of whom were academics and some of whom were not, and really I have a great confidence, I don't think it's arrogance, in being able to weigh and distill ideas. I definitely have a narrative in those, but I don't find people challenge the narrative, but I'm very transparent in the narrative. You can feel what I'm saying and how I back it up. And when I'm taking a position on something, I lay it out there. I don't try to pretend that I'm not taking a position. So it was easy with that. With my attitude, I had no problem finding heterodoxical thinkers among the religious world, among ethicists, and in other areas. It was fun. I rarely do you learn so much in writing something. I learned a lot. I mean, I hadn't read the friggin' major religious tomes of Western civilization. It's an abomination. I really think the world would be better if everybody was required to do the great books series for their first year or two in college. Everybody should read stuff going back from, the Greek and Roman periods all the way through today, and probably sprinkle it in with some more politically correct things of today. But that would shape people's minds and open them up to different viewpoints, because I think this cancel culture, political correctness that has taken over academia and infected the national news media is so anti-liberal. Really, when you come down to it, it's fake liberalism. It's actually autocratic, and it's there is a line between here and Orwell if we're not careful.
So you mentioned that you're able to find heterodox thinkers.